All right, hi team. So I wanted to do a little review of some essay structure and some essay strategies as we get ready for Scarborough. So just a little brief reminder about the way that you format titles. Remember that a novel or a play or a film, something that exists as its own entity, is going to be underlined or italicized. Something that is a shorter text, something that you would think would be included as a piece of something, like something in a textbook or a collection, a song that's part of an album, a poem, a short story, those get quotation marks. So please make sure that you do that correctly. So for Scarborough, you're going to either underline it or italicize it. Remember, if you're using an author's name and you're only using a piece of it, make sure that you use the last name. So you would do Hernandez as opposed to using just Catherine. Remember to stay in present verb tense. The best way to check that is to finish writing and then read it out loud. You'll catch errors that you didn't necessarily see in the writing itself. Remember to use proper MLA citation, so you need both in-text citation as well as a works cited page. If you're only doing the novel and you're not doing any outside research, then you will just have the citation for the novel. But if you do any outside research, any kind of lens application or any kind of sociological research that you want to include, make sure that goes on your works cited. Make sure that your author and your text title are always in your introduction in some way. They don't necessarily need to be part of the thesis, but they do need to appear in that intro. Now, remember that the whole reason that we've done these practice essay outlines is so that you can get this essay structure down. So if there's anything that you don't quite understand still when you get your Gatsby outline back, please make sure that you reach out to me and I can explain something in more detail. But I will be looking for really clear essay structure in this because this is our big essay of the course. So some things to watch for. The topic and concluding sentences of your paragraph need to mirror each other. So you need to have one key phrase that you're going to see repeated. The preview clauses, that means those three little pieces of the preview, need to also match or mirror the topic sentence. And then the concluding sentence needs to have a link to your thesis. So let's look at what that means in terms of like matching a phrase or mirroring it. Here is an essay introduction and a sample paragraph for the poem History Lesson. So I'm going to read the introduction first. In History Lesson, Armstrong depicts colonization as a destroyer of the natural world in order to understand its ongoing effects. Armstrong represents this through the violent imagery of pollution, humanity's need to fight to protect the environment, and the warning of a future without a natural world. The poem expresses that we must all recognize the impact of colonization because its lasting impact will disadvantage all of us. So just to show you, here is the thesis, right? We're talking about how colonization is, we've been talking about that idea of how time is not a linear thing. It's something that's ongoing. It has these ripple effects. This is my preview. I've got 3 key points here, okay? So this should be paragraph or section 1. This should be paragraph or section 2. And this should be paragraph section 3. So one of the things I need to make sure when I do my essay proofreading is, have I followed the order that I laid out in the preview? If I start with violent imagery in my preview, that should be my first paragraph. If I actually write the essay and I decide to put this first, go back and change your preview. So just make sure that the order of the preview actually reflects the order you do in the essay. Then my so what statement is my text to world connection. You can think of it as like a lesson or a moral. Remember, it is telling us why your perspective matters. So it matters because even if you are not part of an Indigenous group, the impact of colonization is a part of what we're all living in. Okay, now let's look at how these pieces are mirroring each other. So this paragraph here is all about the use of violent imagery to depict pollution. So can you see in the first clause, I've literally got a repeated phrase. Okay, so we might think, I shouldn't be repeating myself, I should say things differently. That's true when you get to the point proof analysis, the real core kind of substance of your essay. But when it comes to these structural pieces, the pieces we've been working on in our essay outlines, this actually should be this kind of a match, okay? So that's why I've been saying to you in my comments things like, make sure your phrasing is arguable. Make sure you've got a core thing, a core idea that you can go through and actually highlight like this. I'm not literally saying go through and highlight, but I'm saying, can you actually find that core phrase that then you can use to kind of frame the rest of your writing? So if I'm too wordy, or if I take too long to get to my point, it's really hard for me to find that core phrase. And it's hard for me to find that as a writer. That means it's going to be all the more difficult for my reader. And remember, my reader is not in my head. I want to lay out my argument as clearly as I can so that the reader has no time to take their own thoughts in their own direction. They're following your train of thought. Okay? So here's my body paragraph all about the violent imagery, and you can see I've got some point proof analysis here. Make sure that you're doing this kind of thing where you are integrating your quotations within your writing so that if I read it out loud, Armstrong paints the picture of burying breathing forests in the name of green paper faces of a smiling English lady. I should be able to read it like that. It should flow clearly within my own writing. If I just have green paper faces of a smiling English lady without setting it up, it's not going to do the same work in my reader's head. So always make sure you're integrating your evidence. And that's what I mean. Put it in your own phrasing. Okay, back to mirroring. So in my paragraph, I want to check that I've got the match to my first clause of my previous sentence. I want to then also make sure that I'm showing my reader how this whole paragraph about violent imagery connects to my thesis. So here I've got my last point. Though farmers are supposed to grow and nourish the soil, instead they sow skulls. Miners, rather than extracting resources from the earth, have nothing but gaping holes. Through these violent depictions, colonization's disastrous effects extend beyond history and are shown as ongoing destroyers of nature. Okay. So what I'm doing here is I'm returning to my main idea, these violent depictions. I can make this even a bit stronger by saying these violent depictions of pollution. And then that would be my return, making my topic sentence and concluding sentence mirror each other. I've included my link back to my thesis. Now I need to also include a transition. Now I can do this sentence here as part of the last sentence of this paragraph, or I could make this the first sentence of my next paragraph. It doesn't matter, it's all a style thing. Just make sure you're either always doing it with the end of the body paragraph or always doing it at the beginning. But one more thing that I need to check that I'm mirroring, I need to make sure that as I go into my next paragraph, I'm going to lead my reader from this point, violent imagery, into humanity. So I do have humanity, people. So again, I don't have to use the same exact word, but that is a mirror, right? I'm connecting back. And I've got this phrase, fight to protect the environment. I've got that exact phrase, fight to protect the environment. So now I've matched these pieces. So that's what I mean in terms of mirroring. Let's look at this as a transition, because with my transition statement, I want to lead my reader from going from violent imagery to humanity. So I can do that either by doing a compare or contrast statement, or I could do something like a cause and effect statement. If I just do something like, firstly, we talk about pollution. Secondly, we talk about the environment. Thirdly, we talk about this. That's really just listing. And although that is the kind of thing that we teach you to start doing in say, grade 8 and 9 as you're starting to write paragraphs and essays, in grade 12, you need to think about always taking the opportunity to win the argument, build your argument, make sure that your reader is always following along your train of thought. So if I just go 1, 2, 3, firstly, secondly, thirdly, that doesn't do anything for my reader. It just kind of stops the flow. So instead, build that connection in the argument through that comparison, contrast, or that cause and effect. So because the colonial consequences extend to the destruction of trees, rivers, and animals, so I'm going because we're destroying nature, colonialism also negatively impacts the people who now need to fight back to protect that environment. So that would be what I would call a cause and effect. Because A, B happens. Okay? So that's the kind of thing that you want to build in your transition. You want to show how the argument is going from one piece to another. Remember, always show your work. Okay, so we do this when we talk about math, we do this when we talk about chemistry, when we talk about biology, you have to explain. The same is true when you're doing an essay. It's all about showing your thought process. How did you get to this particular perspective on the essay? So the way that we are showing our work largely has to do with point proof analysis. But one of the comments you might see in some of your writing that I'm giving back to you is you need to push the analysis further. You need to make your analysis more arguable. You need to show me how you got to that point. So let's look at some strategies of how to show your work. Number one, always make your statements arguable. If they're too wordy, or they introduce an element that doesn't unify the paragraph, or they're just a statement of fact, then they're not going to show your work. They're not going to get me inside your head. So always try to look at your thesis, topic, concluding, and transition statements with that question. Could somebody say, no, I disagree with that? So for example, with the text we've just done, A Doll's House, if I say Nora is a woman in a bad marriage, you might say, well, somebody might think this is a good marriage, but I think there's a lot of clues in the play that we're supposed to side with Nora and see how awkward and uncomfortable it is. It's not really taking a strong enough stance. So what is it about this marriage that is so bad? Or what is it about Nora's position in this marriage that matters? So take a stronger stance. Don't be polite. Don't work around to, I think that, or maybe this. Take a stance. Make it a mic drop kind of statement. So instead, Nora's inability to be herself in her marriage results in her deep entrapment and unhappiness. So I'm still talking about how it's a bad marriage, but I'm talking about how it's because she has no sense of self. And I'm adding that kind of connotation, that mic drop, really strong perspective on it. I'm taking a stance. It's entrapment. Always take the opportunity to win the argument. So if you have a sentence in your paragraph, make sure it's doing something. And that's where you can write your essay and then go back and proofread it with that idea of point proof analysis. Do something like take a highlighter and say, what purpose is this serving? Is this point? Is this proof? Or is it analysis? If I have really overly general statements, it's not going to do anything in terms of getting the reader inside my head, showing my work, and it's not going to do anything in terms of winning that argument. So phrases like this has a lot of deep meaning, or this has a lot of symbolism, or this is important. You're getting there, but it's kind of like working around it. You're not getting there in a way that's going to really advance that argument, that's really going to win that debate, that's going to win that fight with your parents, right? So if you do something like names like squirrel, lark, and featherhead are some examples of the negative names, again, it's okay, but it's not taking a strong enough stance. So tell me exactly when you give these examples what they're doing. So diminutive and fragile animal names are used to dehumanize and demean Nora. Add that connotation to tell me what your perspective is on these names. So let's look at another sample paragraph, and I want to kind of go through and show you what this paragraph does well. The diminutively affectionate pet names Torvald addresses Nora with reinforce Torvald's dominance and control in the relationship. That's a strong topic sentence, right? I'm talking about names and the role of names. I'm adding a connotation that they're negative, and I'm telling you why it matters. So it shows his dominance. The pet names reaffirm Torvald's marital expectations for his wife as a person who lives for him and the household. When Torvald teases Nora about her 3-week-long attempt to make Christmas ornaments, Torvald mentions during the dialogue, "Of course you couldn't, poor little girl. You had the best of intentions to please us all, and that's the main thing." The name poor little girl highlights the helplessness he sees in her. Although she's a grown woman, the part girl points to Torvald's childlike view of Nora and stresses his role to care and control her. Throughout the play, the word little repeats to emphasize Torvald's power and his upper hand in their marriage. This line works to remove Nora's individuality and declares her central purpose is to live for others, as the section "Please us all, that's the main thing" hints at. Just as Nora's belittlement becomes evident in the play, Torvald uses similar effects of interpolation in an attempt to internalize weakness in Nora. When Nora pretends to be helpless to stop Torvald from opening Krogstad's letter, Torvald falls for her deception and replies, "This evening I will be wholly and absolutely at your service, you helpless little mortal." The recurring repetition of the word little further establishes Nora's inferiority in the relationship. So this is a paragraph that has a really great use of showing your work. And the way that this author has done it is by close reading. If you look at this, we've really got one point and one quotation, and then this sentence, this sentence, this sentence, this sentence, all are explaining that one piece of evidence. That's what I would call detailed analysis. And you might say, oh, well, what am I going to say? It's obviously, it shows us that it's negative. But by doing things like picking out the phrase, poor little girl, highlights helplessness. They close read the word girl to say that it makes her childlike. They talk about little and how that's repeated, and it talks about power. If somebody's little, somebody's bigger. Then they talk about the piece where it says, "Please us all," and that shows what her purpose is. So they've taken that one line and broken it down into 3 really detailed components by talking about the associations. And that's why we've been doing so much work on close reading and annotating, because this is what it can get you. This is a really, really strong explanation of analysis. So this is another piece of the paragraph so that you can see how it's concluded. And let's just look at how it returns to that topic sentence. Okay, so this is more examples here of extending the analysis and using close reading to explain it. And then here we've got the concluding sentence. The pet names Torvald uses for Nora symbolize the patriarchal household in effect and the encouragement of Nora's fragility and Torvald's control. And you say, look back here, we've got the reference to the pet names, Torvald's control. Okay, so that is an example of how the topic sentence and the concluding sentence mirror one another. Okay, so let's look at a couple more elements just kind of in isolation. So I still don't get how to make my topic sentence more arguable. If you've got something that maybe looks a little bit too general, or if you want to do a check as you are kind of maybe proofreading your essay, look and see, do your topic sentences have a how or a why? So the names Torvald uses have a lot of symbolism, not arguable enough. Fix it by adding a how or a why or a connotation. The diminutively affectionate names Torvald addresses Nora's with reinforce Torvald's dominance. So I've taken the idea of the names, I've said what the symbolism is, that it's about his power and control, and I've added a why. Why does it matter? So here's my connotation, okay, my negative connotation. Here's my why it matters. I still don't get how to expand my analysis. If you look at this example of the quotation we just read, this shows that he thinks of her as a little girl. What's the problem? Well, the point proof analysis structure is there, but the analysis really is just rewording the evidence. It's not showing me your thought process. It's not showing me your work. So again, think about, okay, yeah, it shows that that he thinks of her as a little girl, but is there a positive or negative that I can add? Does it show us that the character is going to be successful in the end? Does the character's ultimate fate tell us something? How do we know that? So those are the kinds of questions that you're building in to expand into your analysis and give that detailed explanation. And again, if you do something like close reading, that's a way to kind of answer these questions. What's the positive? What's the negative? What kind of associations are we making? How do we know it? And that's how you get from this to this. Okay? If you're still struggling with essay introductions, let's look at one more piece. Remember, you need, in an essay introduction, a thesis, a preview, and a so what statement. So your thesis is what you're arguing, your preview is how, and it should be listed as kind of a list of 3 elements. One of the things you might have noticed that I've put on your essay outlines is fix the phrasing so that it is parallel structure. So what I mean by that is that the way that the phrasing is set up, it matches in terms of verb structure, in terms of if you use a pronoun here, like his inapt desire, you've got then his stubbornness and he. So that's what I mean by parallel structure. Make the phrasing match each piece. And if you're not sure what I mean by that, you can look up the grammar term parallel structure, and you can see several different examples of that, okay? And then the so what statement is your why or your text to world connection. So let's look at this essay intro. In Half of a Yellow Sun, Richard represents the connection between race and social privilege. Despite him having experienced the Biafran War alongside Biafrans, he is a white man. As a white man, he only serves as a witness, not a victim. So this is the argument that even though Richard wants to look at himself as the same as the other characters, because of his privilege, he's never going to have that understanding. We see this through paragraph 1, his inapt desire to be accepted by the Igbos. Paragraph 2, his stubbornness and denial of his privilege. Paragraph 3, how unchanged he is after the massacre at the airport. So what you can see is in the preview, it's not just a list of events or a list of symbols. It's got connotations attached to it. It's got, if I am going to have a paragraph that's focused on one event, I'm not just talking about and Richard at the airport. I'm explaining what that shows, how unchanged he is. And I'm using, again, connotations. Okay, so never just list events. Always make sure there's an arguable element, because again, if you make this preview really strong, I can now just take this inapt desire to be accepted, and that's my topic sentence. And then what does this teach us, or what's the text to world connection? This issue of white privilege still exists today as white people continue to systemically receive social and economical advantages for no other reason than the color of their skin. So think of it again as your text to world connection, your why, or your mic drop moment. Why does it matter? Wow, that's a powerful statement. I want to read this person's perspective. Okay, so I'm just breaking it down here. Remember, the thesis is what you're arguing. It needs to be a specific enough phrase that you can repeat it at the end of every paragraph. The preview outlines the how, follows the order in my essay. The why tells us why we care. And again, think of it as mic drop. Okay, transitions. If you have a really good preview statement, this also is going to help you with your transitions, because basically you can just take these pieces that you outline in your preview and you're going to connect this from an in-app desire to talk about how that relates to, so his desire for acceptance, how does that relate to his stubbornness? So you need to show us how these things link. You could compare and contrast them, or you could show us cause and effect. So for example, if topic sentence 1 is Richard's desire to be accepted shows his selfishness and ignorance to the fact that his experience of war is incomparable because of the privilege he receives as a white man. This is a great example of a topic sentence that's also building in that thesis connection of privilege. Argument 2 is about his denial of his privilege and his stubbornness. So my concluding sentence here is, therefore, while Richard's desire to be seen as a Biafran is understandable, it is also wrong because he shows how unaware he is of the fact he will never have to live through the same horrors as Biafrans because of his privilege as a white man. This lack of awareness also leads to Richard's failure to recognize his privilege. Just as Richard's desire to be accepted as Biafra makes him deeply flawed, so does his inability and lack of awareness in recognizing his privilege. Okay, so this is 2 different ways to do it. Here, it's built into the end of paragraph 1. This lack of awareness causes his failure to recognize his privilege. Or here, this is more like a comparison. Just as his desire to be accepted makes him flawed, so does his lack of awareness in recognizing his privilege. Okay, so you can do either. This is an example of building it in as cause and effect. This is an example of building it in as comparison. Remember to always integrate your evidence. So never leave it just as a quotation that stands in on its own. I gave you this at the very beginning of the course, and I've linked it in here. And remember, there's also some little videos demonstrating kind of a funny example of how to do it. But if you're still not sure how to set up your evidence, remember you do have this document that gives you several different ways you can set up that phrasing. And remember, the most important thing is you want to keep the reader in your head, not in their own. So if I just leave a quotation on its own without setting it up, I'm risking the reader interpreting it in a way that isn't actually going to be helpful for my argument. So always keep that reader in your head. Okay, let's do one more little review of how to do a comparison contrast essay, because some of you are doing 2 characters for Scarborough. Remember, you have the choice to either focus your essay on 1 character or to talk about 2, but I do not recommend adding more than 2 characters. And here's the demonstration of why. Okay, so I have added some handouts here that in the slides that I'll link, you can click and open them up. But let's do 2 samples. First, I'm going to do it as if I was writing an essay on Batman and Spider-Man. So here's my thesis. Batman and Spider-Man are superheroes who display inner turmoil between good and evil, but because Batman's powers are motivated by intellect, he is the more conflicted character. So my thesis is that they both have turmoil, but the source of their power affects the kind of their success or their conflict. So when you're doing a comparison contrast essay, you can either just compare, or you can just contrast, or you can do both. This would be an example of an essay that's doing both. Okay, so I'm going to brainstorm what these 2 characters have in common. And you can see I'm kind of working in 3s. It doesn't mean that I'm only going to have 3 body paragraphs. When I go to a comparison contrast essay, I would recommend that you think of it in terms of 3 sections. And that's going to allow you, if you have a lot to say about 1 character and you need more than a paragraph to say it, that's going to allow you that freedom. So think of it in 3 sections instead of 3 paragraphs. But here are my 3 sections. They both struggle with their superhero identity. They both make choices they regret. But the way that their powers come in affects the way that they occupy their positions as heroes. Spider-Man's are imposed upon him. Batman comes from this need to take revenge. So I have two choices. I can do Model A, which is called the block method. In this method, I separate my characters. So I say everything I want to about Spider-Man. Then I say everything I want to about Batman. And then I have a separate paragraph where I draw comparisons and contrasts between them. I'm still, if you see, talking about three kind of core ideas. Here, this could be, section 1 could be one paragraph, and these could be 3 points in my paragraph. But section 1 could be about Spider-Man, and I could include these 2 points in one paragraph, and this could be his another paragraph. So section 1 could be 2 paragraphs, for example. And then when I go to Batman, I might have this one be 1 paragraph, and this one be 1 paragraph, and this one be 1 paragraph. So I need to make sure that I'm talking about the two characters equally, because when you're doing a comparison contrast, we're worried about balance. We don't want it to be mostly about Spider-Man and then Batman just gets thrown in. But if you think of it in terms of sections instead of in paragraphs, it gives you a little bit more room, because you might have more to say on this point for Spider-Man and more to say on this point for Batman. You can also see that I'm still kind of keeping the ideas similar, right? I'm talking about struggling with identity, the choices he regrets with his uncle and girlfriend, but how he's using his powers. Here I'm talking about how he also struggles with his identity, the choices he regrets with his parents and his girlfriend, and how he relates to his powers. So I'm still keeping these and the order of points relatively consistent, because when you add in more than one character, your reader has a lot more to keep track of, so you want to keep it as organized and as consistent as you can. And then this paragraph is all about maybe talking about how ultimately maybe Spider-Man's going to be a little bit more free because he's younger. He's got that kind of like adolescent mindset, and he's still kind of having fun with his powers, whereas Batman is a little bit more tormented. Okay? So that is called the block method, where I separate my sections by character. This is called the alternating method. And in this method, I talk about them together. And so instead of separating my sections or paragraphs by character, I'm going to separate them by ideas or argument. So I'm going to talk section 1. And remember, section 1 could be a paragraph or multiple paragraphs. But I'm going to talk about section 1 is how they struggle with their superhero identity. I'm going to talk about Spider-Man, then I'm going to talk about Batman. Section 2, I'm going to talk about the choices they regret. I'm going to talk about Spider-Man, then I'm going to talk about Batman. Section 3, I'm going to talk about acceptance of their identity versus the idea of conflict and revenge. I'm going to talk about Spider-Man, then I'm going to talk about Batman. As you can see, I'm going to, again, because this is a lot for my reader to keep track of, I want to keep it as consistent as possible. So if I talk about Spider-Man first in section 1, I got to talk about Spider-Man first in section 2. I'm thinking of this in terms of sections. So this could be paragraph 1, paragraph 2, paragraph 3, paragraph 4, paragraph 5, paragraph 6. Okay, this is where we're starting to move beyond a 5-paragraph essay structure. Or this could be paragraph 1, paragraph 2, paragraph 3. It depends on how much you have to say, okay? Remember now, too, because I'm taking my reader from one character to another, I'm going to have to make a really strong transition here. So I'm going to say, Spider-Man struggles with his superhero identity because it is imposed upon him. He has these powers he doesn't know how to use. Batman also struggles with his superhero identity. However, that struggle is coming from a different place because it is one that he's chosen. That's my transition. And in my transition, I've made a comparison contrast statement. Therefore, because I'm putting these together, I'm doing comparison contrast all the way through. Therefore, I don't need this separate section. Okay, so that's the big difference between these two models. With the block model, you have to have a separate section drawing them together. With the integrated model, or Model B, you're doing that comparison contrast as you go. It does not matter to me which model you choose. Sometimes Model A works better if you have really different characters and you want to do a more contrasting than comparing. Sometimes Model A works better if you're a more logical, linear thinker. You like having ideas separated. Model B works if you want to not have the work of doing that comparison contrast at the end. If you're doing an in-class writing, I would recommend Model B rather than A, because sometimes what happens is you run out of time and you end up talking about, you run out of time and you talk a lot about Spider-Man, and then you don't get to talk that much about Batman. Whereas here in Model B, you're already doing that comparison, or say you don't get to that last comparison contrast piece. So if you're doing a timed writing, I would recommend Model B. But otherwise, it's really a stylistic thing in terms of you as a writer, and it's about the characters and how easily they kind of can go into one section together. So let's look at one more example related specifically to Scarborough. So let's say I wanted to do a comparison contrast essay on Bing and Clive and their identity as LGBTQ, and ultimately how they are kind of a foil for each other in the novel. So if I was doing the block method, Model A, I would talk about Bing in my first section. I might talk about how he's Filipino and his mother is an immigrant, so he already comes from a non-dominant group, Catholic, and how that already is a kind of barrier to his acceptance. Then I would talk about the family support, how his father is so negative, but his mother is so loving and accepting. And then I would talk about how that contributes to his sense of self and his ultimate celebration of self at the end. Section or paragraph 2, I would talk about Clive. He also comes from this non-dominant group. He's also an immigrant. And we can see, through Winsome, and she's quite conservative in some of her beliefs. Obviously, he comes from a conservative background in that he decided he wanted a heterosexual marriage. Because he is hiding the truth, he has a lack of family support and a lack of knowledge, which is a big contrast to somebody like Bing. And ultimately, at the end, we see his sense of shame and him partaking in this at-risk behavior. So then section 3 would be comparing and contrasting them. And I would probably focus on how, because Bing has love and support, and because of his mother's sacrifices and her efforts to understand him, he ultimately is going to have a much better life as an LGBTQ person than Clive does. So that would be the block method. The alternating method, I would say I would talk about it in sections. So I would talk about how they're both from this non-dominant, non-accepting background. I would talk about Bing, then Clive. Then I would talk about the amount or lack of family support. I would talk about Bing, then Clive. Then I would talk about their ultimate sense of self and how much they accept themselves. And I would talk about Bing, and then I would talk about Clive. So that's an example, again, of what you need to do when you're doing a comparison contrast of characters. And if you see how much work it takes for me to structure these two characters, this is why I say 2 characters and no more. Because if you add another character, you're adding a whole other big piece here, a whole other section, and you're adding another character. Now I need to not just compare Bing to Clive, and let's say I'm going to also do Victor. I need to compare Bing and Clive, but I also need to compare Bing and Victor, and then I also need to compare Clive and Victor. So again, I'm adding an exponential amount of work with each character that I add. So that's why I'm telling you to stick to 2. Okay? So last piece of advice as you're getting ready to finish off this essay. I know we are all under a lot of pressure and a lot of work, And some of us feel like we do our best work under pressure. I get that. I was like that as a student as well. But I will tell you from experience, your work is going to be so much better if you can give yourself at least a few hours between finishing that essay and having time to proofread it, to go back and check all those elements that I just went through. And those hours should not be at, 10 at night. So try, if you can, to maybe get your essay done for something like Monday morning. Take a few hours away from it. Start looking at it again at maybe 6 or 7 at night, and give yourself that time, because you will see things as a proofreader, as an editor of your own work, that you would not see if you were just, okay, I'm finishing it, I'm going to do a quick read and hand it in. So we can't underestimate the importance of being our own editors and proofreading. And you're proofreading not just for spelling and grammar. You're proofreading for things like, do my pieces of my essay mirror each other? Do I have point proof analysis? Have I built in that transition? Those are the kinds of things that you need to be checking so that this essay can be a real reflection of your best work and your best ideas. Hopefully this was helpful for you. I'm going to post the slides as well. And of course, always reach out if you have questions. Take care, everybody.